Hello and welcome to Chapter 7, Adjectivals. We are going to talk all about all kinds of great stuff that can modify nouns in this chapter. And just like in Chapter 6, we're going to start off with things we already knew could play this role, things we already knew could modify nouns in this case. One group of things that we already knew could modify nouns are, of course, determiners, as well as the adjectives and nouns that precede the noun headword. You'll remember that lots and lots of things can function as determiners. Articles, possessive nouns, possessive determiners, demonstrative determiners, and numbers. If you are having trouble remembering all of this great stuff, check out page 261 in our textbook. But remember that lots of things can go in between the determiner and the headword. Adjectives, pre-headword nouns, and then the headword noun in that order. So for example, look at this handy dandy chart. We could have all kinds of determiners, the, my, and, that. Bills, a possessive determiner, now possessive noun. We can have adjectives, turquoise, ancient, old. One thing I think that's cool is that we can have nouns modifying other nouns from the pre-headword position. So for example, Twitter is a noun, of course, it's a proper noun. But in the third example, my new Twitter account, it's modifying account. Right? Bill's old kitchen, the final example. Kitchen is certainly capable of being the headword in that chain. It just isn't, right? Kitchen is modifying table here. This is review. We already knew all these great things could modify nouns. Here's a little bit of bonus info on that front. Adjectives in the noun phrase can be modified. For example, the extremely turquoise sunglasses. We can have more than one adjective in the noun phrase, like the sweet white bulldog. And participles can sometimes fill the adjective slot, as in the example, the rolling stones. Rolling is the present participle. More coming up on that soon, I promise. But be advised that participles, because they're verbs, often have adverbial modifiers of their own. For example, our loudly snoring bulldog. Loudly is modifying snoring, the participle, or the carefully painted wagon. Thus, the determiner carefully is modifying painted, right? And painted, the participle, is modifying. Let's talk about something else that we know can modify nouns already. Prepositional phrases. Of course, we're talking about adjectival prepositional phrases here, the kind that answer nouny questions. Nouny questions like which one or what kind of. Let's review. Butch is the bulldog on the sofa. What question does this answer? It answers the which one question. Which bulldog is Butch? The one on the sofa. Or how about Cassidy is a bulldog of many talents? What question is being answered here? In this case, it's what kind of? What kind of bulldog is Cassidy? Well, she's one of many talents. We've also seen prepositional phrases embedded within each other to form massive chains, such as my sister manages the flower shop in the new brick building near the park on Center Street. Be advised that we can have ambiguities here. We don't know what's on Center Street in this example. Is it the park or is it the building? It's diagrammed one way on page 137, and we'd need to clarify its meaning if we wanted to imply the other instance. My sister manages the flower shop in the brick building on Center Street. That is near the park. And that is going to be really important heading into our next topic, relative clauses. Finally, at long last. I've been alluding to this usage of that for quite some time, and now it is here. So relative pronoun that is going to be one of our relative pronouns introducing relative clauses. What is a relative clause? Well, a relative clause is a dependent clause, but it's adjectival in function. In our last lesson, for Chapter 6, we learned about dependent clauses introduced by subordinators. Here we are talking, and those are adverbial, right? Here we are talking about adjectival dependent clauses. Relative clauses almost always appear after the noun or pronoun they're modifying, so you can be on the lookout for them right in the rear of the thing they're modifying. And they are identifying the noun or the pronoun they're modifying. In fact, the relative pronoun is replacing the noun or pronoun that is being modified. So relative clauses are going to ask nouny questions. They're going to ask nouny questions like which one? So for example, the train that has left the station is the Pennsylvania 6500. Well, which train? the one that has left the station. Or they'll answer the nouny question, what kind of? For example, Girl Scouts are young women who bring me cookies. What kind of young women are they? Those who bring me cookies. Okay. So they're answering these nouny questions. Another thing to keep in mind about relative clauses is that, hey, they are clauses, as the name implies. They are clauses, they're clauses. So they are sentence patterns in and of themselves. The only difference between an independent clause and a relative clause is the relative pronoun that introduces the clause. Okay, so I've been building up to this moment. What are the relative pronouns? Who, whose, whom, which, and that. That's it! That's all, folks. There are only those 5. It's really nice. We don't have to learn any other relative pronouns, just those 5. Pretty exciting. So let's look at how these relative clauses are going to help us diagram things. Let's look at that sample sentence I gave you. The train that has left the station is the Pennsylvania 6500. Here is the diagram. The train itself, the train is the Pennsylvania 6500. Which one? It's the train that has left the station. So the relative pronoun that is referring to the train. We're connecting the pronoun to the thing it refers to, connecting the pronoun to its referent. So that gives us the train has left the station. That is standing in for the train. So that is the subject in its clause, and it's also standing in for the subject in the main clause, in the independent clause. And our first main clause, independent clause, is pattern 3. Our relative clause is pattern 7. Notice the connection of the relative pronoun to its referent. That's going to be crucial moving forward. Let's look at some additional sentences. I gave you the sentence, Girl Scouts are young women who bring me cookies. Let's take a look. In this case, we are not replacing the subject of the sentence. We're replacing the subject complement. Girl Scouts are young women. Women, of course, pattern 3 sentence here again. Women is the subject complement. Women are the subject complement. And who is replacing women. It's standing in for women as the subject in its own clause. Notice that our relative clause is pattern 8 here. Me is our indirect object, and the women is the subject in that clause. So this is how relative pronouns work in relative clauses. Let's talk about a few more things that relative clauses always do. They always rename the head word of the noun phrase which they're modifying. So that is replacing train in our Pennsylvania 6500 example. They are always filling a slot in their own clause. This is crucial. The relative pronoun fills a slot in its clause. In this example, that fills the subject slot. And this is crucial. The relative clause will always begin with the relative pronoun, even if the relative pronoun doesn't fill the subject slot in its own clause. Ooh, look out! We're going to be talking more about this soon. But here again, we see that replacing train, connected to train there. We see that filling the subject slot in this clause, and we notice that in the sentence itself, that began the relative clause. The relative pronoun always begins the clause. I alluded to the fact that the relative pronoun might not always be in the subject slot. Let's look at an example. This is my favorite example because it comes from the great Aretha Franklin classic. This is the house that Jack built. And she says, remember this house, over and over. You should remember this house too, the house that Jack built, because it's our great example of the relative pronoun in the object slot. Because here, the relative clause is clearly modifying the noun house, but the clause itself, the relative clause that Jack built, obviously has another subject. Jack is the subject of the relative clause. So what is the role of that? It's the thing that Jack built. It's the direct object, and we would diagram it like so. This is the house that Jack built. What did Jack build? The house. He built the house. So Jack is the subject of the clause. The relative pronoun that is the object of the clause. Do not just slap the relative pronoun in the front because it opens the relative clause. It doesn't always go there. We spent quite a bit of time talking about that. Let's talk about some other relative pronouns now. Who and whom. When we're talking about people, we say who and whom instead of that. We remember that who is for the subject of the clause, For example, Harry Potter is the boy who lived. So here again, who is standing in for the subject complement boy, right? Giving us a pattern 6 sentence. And this is really nice because who and whom are subjective and objective case. You don't have to wonder to yourself, where does this go in the relative clause the way you do with that? Because who will always be in the subject slot and whom will always be in the object slot. It is the object of the clause. A girl whom I met at band camp played the sousaphone. Here's the diagram. A girl played the sousaphone is our independent clause, and whom is replacing girl, but it's the object of its clause. I met a girl at band camp, right? Whom is replacing girl. It's the object. So if it's whom, we're dealing with the object. If it's who, it's the subject, and you don't have to think it through. Just one more quick example of whom in the object slot. Here's a slightly more complicated sentence. This is the kind of thing you'll be doing on your midterm, for example. Tom Hiddleston, to whom Amanda wrote fan letters, was very happy to receive her attentions. Don't be thrown off by the to in front of whom. Remember that in pattern 8, sentence pattern 8, we have the indirect object appearing one of two ways, right? It could appear in the middle of the sentence without a to, or it could follow a to at the end of the sentence. Tom Hiddleston, to whom Amanda wrote fan letters. Amanda wrote fan letters to Tom Hiddleston, right? Is how we would say the sentence pattern 8 if we weren't using a relative pronoun. So whom is standing in for the indirect object here, which happens to be the subject of the main clause. You'll notice I threw an infinitive phrase in there also, just to keep you on your toes. Don't confuse the to introducing whom with the to introducing the infinitive. Fun, fun, fun. Let's talk about the possessive case of who, which of course is whose. The dog whose ball Butch stole was absent today. Whose is kind of an interesting case here because we have the clause, the main clause, the dog was absent, and clearly Butch stole the ball. Now whose is telling us which dog, right? The dog whose ball Butch stole. Right, but it's also playing a role with regard to the word ball, isn't it? The dog whose ball Butch stole. Guess what? Whose is the relative pronoun, and it's the determiner for ball. It's the possessive determiner. We would diagram it like this. The relative pronoun always plays a role in its clause, but it doesn't have to play a role on the main line of its clause. It could be a determiner, just the way that it is here. Dog whose ball Butch stole. Oh, bad boy, Butch. Bad boy. Let's talk about which to wrap up our relative pronouns. Jude the Obscure, which Gail loves, is a classic that elicits confusion. Ooh, two relative clauses in one sentence. Of course, it can happen. Here, which is referring to Jude the Obscure, but just because it comes first in the relative clause doesn't mean it plays a subject role in its own clause, right? Gail loves Jude the Obscure. Is pattern 7, and is a classic that elicits confusion. The classic elicits confusion. So we have 3 clauses in one sentence, pretty exciting. One other thing to keep in mind moving forward, though, is that. Sometimes gets elided. Okay, so if I said, you can choose a color that you like, I would diagram it just this way. And that's a sentence I would totally say in English. You can choose a color that you like. But I don't have to say that if I don't want to, right? I might just say, you can choose a color you like. This is crucial. We are totally allowed to elide the that and take it out, but that doesn't mean it disappears. It does not. Right? It's invisible, but it's still playing the role in its own clause. In this case, the role of the object. You like the color, right? A color. So it has to play a role in the sentence. We can't just get rid of it. We could put a little X in the slot where the that would go, or we could put that in parentheses. A lot to pay attention to here. Don't be afraid to come back and review this section. Butch is the dog that encourages you to keep working hard. Keep at it, and you will get these relative pronouns down.